The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1865, and Edith Monroe did not need to open it to know what it said, because she had already felt the end of the war in her bones 3 weeks before the official word reached the small town of Caldwell Creek. Kansas felt it the way a person feels the change in the air before the first real rain of the season, when everything goes still, and the cattle move toward the fence line, and the sky turns a color that has no proper name. She set the letter on the kitchen table anyway, smoothed her apron with both hands, and walked to the window that faced the long dirt road leading out of town toward the eastern horizon. The candle she had placed there every single night for 2 years and 7 months was burning low, its wax pooled like a melted confession around the brass holder her mother had left her, but it was still burning. She had made sure of that. Caldwell Creek in the autumn of 1865 was a town that existed in a kind of suspended breath. The war had taken its young men and returned some of them changed beyond recognition, and some of it had not returned them at all. The main street held a general store run by old Clarence Duffy, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, a blacksmith shop, 2 saloons that had seen their share of sorrow since the fighting started, a small white church with a bell that had cracked on the 4th of July in 1863 and never been replaced, and a boarding house run by a widow named Agnes Peel who kept her prices fair and her gossip sharper than the butcher's best knife. Edith Monroe was 24 years old, and she ran the small farm at the edge of town that her father had left her when he passed away from a fever in the spring of 1862. 3 months before the man she loved rode away with a rifle across his saddle, and a look in his eyes that she could not read all the way until the dust he raised had completely disappeared. She had 40 acres, 12 head of cattle, a mule named Corporal that had strong opinions about mornings, and a vegetable garden that she tended with a stubbornness that her neighbor Mrs. Harriet Bloom called admirable, and that Edith herself simply called necessary. Wallace Weston had been 26 when he left, which made him 28 now, and Edith had done that arithmetic so many times in the years since his departure that the numbers felt worn smooth like river stones. He had come to her the night before he rode out, had stood at the edge of her porch with his hat in his hands and his dark hair pushed back from his forehead, and he had looked at her in a way that required no translation whatsoever. "I don't have the right to ask you to wait," he had said. "No," she agreed, "you don't, but I'm hoping you will. I know you are." Edith, just her name, said quietly, the way a man says something he has carried a long way and set down carefully. "Go on, Wallace," she had told him, "and come back." He had pressed her hand briefly, just her fingers in his, and then he had walked off into the dark toward the stable where his horse was waiting. She had stood on that porch until she could no longer hear his footsteps. Then she had gone inside and placed the first candle in the window. The letter on her kitchen table was from the United States War Department, and it confirmed, in the careful language of official correspondence, that the conflict was at an end, and that the men of the volunteer regiments were being mustered out and sent homeward. It said nothing specific about Wallace Weston. It didn't need to. If he were dead, she would have received a different kind of letter, or no letter at all, and in either case she would have known, because there had been a moment in the spring of this same year when she had walked out to the fence at dusk and looked at the sky and felt something go very still inside her, and then slowly continue again, like a heart that stumbles and catches itself. And she had understood that whatever had nearly happened to him had not happened, and that he was still alive and moving toward home. She was not a woman given to mystical thinking. She read the Bible on Sundays because it was the proper thing to do, and because she found genuine comfort in certain passages, but she held no particular belief in signs or visions or communications through the ether. What she believed in was paying attention. She had paid very close attention to Wallace Weston for years before the war, had watched the way he worked, the way he moved through difficulties with a kind of steady patience that was rare in young men, the way he looked at a problem and then looked at it again from another angle before deciding what to do about it. She knew him the way you know a piece of land you have farmed for a long time, every low place where the water gathers, every rocky rise where nothing much will grow, every stretch of good dark soil where things tend to come up strong. And so she knew he was coming home. She just didn't know exactly when. The days after the letter arrived fell into their usual rhythm, though the whole town had a different quality to it, like a song played in a different key. Men were drifting back, one or two at a time, and each arrival brought its own complicated emotion to Caldwell Creek. Tom Briggs came home missing 2 fingers on his left hand and became quieter than he had ever been before. Samuel Gier arrived to find that his wife had taken their children to live with her parents in Missouri and had no intention of coming back, and he stood in the middle of the main street for a long while before walking into one of the saloons. Young Peter Adler, who had been only 18 when he enlisted, came back looking 40 and spent the first week sitting on the porch of his mother's house, not saying anything at all. Edith helped where she could. She brought food, she listened. She did not ask questions that people weren't ready to answer. She had kept this community going in the small daily ways that nobody recorded but everyone needed, through 2 harvests and 2 winters, and all the ordinary disasters and minor triumphs that a farming community produces without ceasing regardless of what the larger world is doing with its armies. And every evening, without exception, she replaced the stub of the candle in her window with a fresh one, and lit it before the last light left the sky. Agnes Peel mentioned it once gently, in the way that Agnes Peel mentioned things when she was not quite willing to be direct. "That light in your window," she said, over tea in Edith's kitchen in late October. "Every single night." "Every single night," Edith confirmed. "And you don't know when he's coming." "No. Or even for certain that he's coming," Edith said, and the firmness in her voice was not the brittle kind that comes from refusing to consider the alternative, but the solid kind that comes from having considered every alternative very carefully and arrived at a conclusion. Agnes looked at her for a moment and then nodded and let the subject rest, which was actually the highest form of courtesy that Agnes Peel was capable of. The November cold arrived early that year, sweeping down from the north with a seriousness that cracked the remaining leaves from the cottonwood trees along the creek bed, and sent the cattle huddling together in the far corner of the pasture. Edith split her own firewood, which scandalized 2 of her nearest neighbors and struck the others as simply practical, and she caulked the gaps in the farmhouse walls with a mixture of clay and straw that her father had taught her, and she made sure the barn was tight enough for the livestock to manage through what looked to be a serious winter. She was in the barn one afternoon in mid-November, repairing a section of fencing with a mallet and a handful of nails, when she heard the sound of hooves on the frost-hardened ground outside. She listened. One horse, walking slowly, with the measured pace of an animal that had been traveling for a considerable distance and had nothing urgent left to prove. She set the mallet down and stood up straight and pushed the loose hair back from her face with the back of her wrist. She walked to the barn door and opened it. The horse was a roan she didn't recognize, a good animal gone lean from hard use, and the man on its back was wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather and a hat that had seen better months, and he was looking at the farmhouse with an expression on his face that she could not have described but would have recognized from any distance in any light. Wallace Weston. He turned his head and saw her standing in the barn doorway, and for a moment neither of them moved. The wind pulled at her hair and sent a dry leaf skittering across the frozen ground between them. The horse lowered its head and blew a long breath into the cold air. He was thinner than he had been, and there were lines in his face that hadn't been there before, and his eyes held something that she recognized because she had seen it in the faces of the men who had come back before him, that particular quality of having looked at the world from a perspective that alters the view permanently. But he was whole. He was upright in the saddle. He was here. He swung down from the horse with the deliberate movements of a man whose body was tired past the ordinary kind of tired, and he stood there holding the reins and looking at her, and she walked toward him, not running, just walking steadily the way she had walked through everything for the past 2 years and 7 months. And she stopped when she was close enough to see the weather-cracked texture of his skin and the particular dark brown of his eyes that she had spent 2 winters trying to remember with perfect accuracy and had almost, but not quite, managed. "War is over," he said, and his voice was rougher than she remembered, lower and more careful, as if he was still not quite sure of the sound of ordinary words in peacetime. "I know," she said. "I got the letter 3 weeks ago." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the beginning of the muscles that made one. "I rode all the way from Georgia," he said. "I had this notion that I needed to come tell you." "You did need to come," she said. "The telling I already had, I did not." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he looked at the farmhouse, at the window where the afternoon light showed faintly from within, though the candle wouldn't be visible until full dark. Have you been keeping a light in that window?" "Every night," she said. "Since the night you left." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something raw in them, something that he had clearly been holding back across a very considerable number of miles. "Edith," he said, and she heard in it the same quality as that night 2 years ago when he had said her name on the porch and meant everything that couldn't be organized into sentences. "Come inside," she said. "Your horse needs seeing too, and you look like you haven't eaten a proper meal since the Confederacy gave up." He laughed at that, short and surprised, and the sound of it hit her somewhere in the chest in a way that made her briefly have to look away. She took the reins from his hand and led the roan into the barn, and he followed her. And they moved through the familiar routine of settling a horse with an ease that required no instruction, working in the close, warm space of the barn together the way people work who have done tasks alongside each other before and remember the rhythm without having to relearn it. She put feed in front of the horse and he filled the water bucket from the pump, and when the roan was comfortable and they had nothing left to do in the barn, they stood for a moment in the way of people who have a great deal to say and no particular agreement yet on where to begin. "How long have you been traveling?" she asked. 43 days, he said. "I counted them. 43 days is a long way to ride for information a person already has." "You already said that." "I know. I like the way it sounds." He looked at her with something that was unmistakably the beginning of warmth, the particular kind that comes back slowly when it's been a long time extinguished, like a fire built from coals that were only barely still alive. "I like the way most things you say sound," he said. "I'd forgotten that. I hadn't forgotten it, actually. I'd been carrying the memory of it so long that the real thing is different." "Better or worse?" "Better," he said. "It's considerably better." She nodded, satisfied with that, and led him out of the barn and across the frozen yard to the farmhouse door. Inside, she stoked the fire and put water on for coffee, moving through her kitchen with the comfortable authority of a woman who has run her own household for 3 years and knows exactly where everything is and why it is there. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair he had always used, back when he used to come by before the war, back when the neighbors had opinions about how often a single young man visited a single young woman, and how they sat on that porch in the evenings, and the conversations ran later than was strictly proper. He sat there now with the same quality of belonging to that chair that she had noticed before, the way certain people fit certain places, as if the space itself remembers them. She put a plate of cold biscuits and a jar of preserves in front of him, and he ate steadily and without apology, the way a hungry man eats, and she sat across from him and watched him and let the silence be what it was, which was comfortable and full rather than empty. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and he wrapped both hands around his and looked at the steam rising from it with an expression of uncomplicated gratitude. "I thought about this," he said, "sitting at this table with hot coffee. I thought about it a considerable number of times." "What else did you think about?" He looked up at her. "You," he said simply. "Mostly you." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees along the property line, a sound like running water. Edith set her cup down and folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the directness that had always been one of her most pronounced qualities, the thing that made certain people in Caldwell Creek describe her as a lot to contend with and made other people, the better ones, describe her as honest. "You should know," she said, "that there were people who told me to give it up. Give up waiting, I mean. Move on. Stop putting that candle in the window every night like some kind of—" They had various unflattering ways of describing it. "What did you tell them?" "I told them it wasn't their window and it wasn't their candle and I would decide what to do with both of them myself." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you keep it, truly?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I knew you were out there," she said. "And because I wanted you to know that wherever you were heading, there was a direction that had a light on for you. I suppose I thought, even if you couldn't see it from Georgia, even if you never knew about it, the fact of it being there meant something. It meant I hadn't given up on the possibility of you." "The possibility of me," he repeated quietly, as if he was testing the weight of those words. "Of you coming back," she said. "Of what might come after." He reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of his, and the gesture was so simply done, so ordinary in the best sense of that word, that she felt the full impact of it only after a moment, the way the sound of a bell continues after the ringing has stopped. "I came back," he said. "I see that," she said. "What comes after is up to you. I know that too." Outside, the early winter dark was coming down, and the candle in the window was invisible from the inside of the kitchen, where the firelight made everything warm and amber. But she knew it was there, had lit it before sunset as she always did, and she found herself thinking that there was something right about the fact that it was burning now, tonight, on this particular evening, when it was no longer a message sent out into uncertainty, but simply a light that continued because it had always continued. Because some things, once established with sufficient intention, go on. They talked for a long time that evening. He told her about the last months of the war, not the details of the fighting, which he clearly had no intention of discussing at any length, but the details that were easier to speak. The red Georgia clay after a rain, the way the light fell through pine forests in the early morning, the particular quality of stillness on the last day, when the guns went quiet, and the silence seemed to be waiting for something to tell it that it was allowed to stay. He told her about the ride home, the weeks of moving through a changed landscape, through towns that were rebuilding and fields that were growing up in weeds and bridges that had been destroyed and rebuilt imperfectly, and ferries that had to be argued with, and rivers that had to be forded when the ferries weren't available. She told him about the farm. She told it matter-of-factly, without making herself sound heroic, though the work had been genuinely hard, and the winter of 1863 had been a close thing when 3 of her cattle died, and she'd had to sell off half the kitchen garden seed stock to make up the difference. She told him about Corporal the mule's ongoing difficulty with mornings, and about the fence the Henderson's bull had broken through twice in 1 week, and about the way the cottonwood trees along the creek had come down in a summer storm, and how she and old Mr. Prentice from the adjacent property had spent 3 days cutting them up for firewood. He listened the way he had always listened, with his full attention, not the performance of attention that some men gave you when they were waiting for you to finish so they could speak, but the real thing, the kind that shows in the eyes. At some point the coffee was finished and the fire needed to be built up again, and it was fully dark outside, and the question of where he was going to sleep became relevant. She told him the spare room was available, the same one that had been her father's study, and that she had converted after his death, and he accepted without making any kind of ceremony of it, just nodded and said that was very kind and he would try not to be any trouble. "You were never trouble," she said, which was not entirely accurate but was accurate enough for tonight. He slept for what she assumed was a very long time, and she sat up a while longer by the fire with her mending, listening to the wind outside and the occasional pop of the fire and the distant sound of Corporal shifting in the barn. and she felt something inside her that had been held very tightly for 2 years and 7 months begin, carefully, to ease. The following morning she was already up and had breakfast started when she heard him moving in the next room, the particular sounds of a person waking up in an unfamiliar place and remembering where they are. She heard him stop moving for a moment, presumably at the memory, and then she heard him pull on his boots and come to the kitchen doorway. He looked rested, though not fully restored, which was the work of days rather than a single night. He looked at the stove where she was turning bacon, and at the table where the coffee pot was waiting, and at her, in her everyday dress with her hair pinned up and her face showing the same morning practicality that he had apparently thought about across considerable distances. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He poured himself a cup of coffee without being told where it was, which suggested he remembered. "What can I do?" She handed him a knife and pointed at the potatoes. He sat down and began slicing them without argument, and the comfortable domesticity of the scene had a quality that she was aware of noting and deciding she liked without making a fuss about noting it. Over breakfast he asked about the farm's situation, the practical details, and she gave them honestly. The cattle were healthy, 12 head still. She had maintained the herd through some difficult winters. The fencing on the north side needed attention. The barn roof had a section that was going to require serious work before the heavy snow came. She had money saved, not a great deal but enough to manage, from 3 years of careful accounting and a decision in the summer of 1864 to sell off a portion of her grain to the Army Depot at a favorable price. He listened to all of this and then was quiet for a moment. "I have some money," he said. "Not much. My pay from the Army. I haven't spent much of it because there wasn't much occasion to spend it on anything worth having." She looked at him steadily. "What are your plans, Wallace?" He met her look with the same directness. "I had a plan for 2 years," he said, "which was to come back here. I didn't think much beyond that because I wasn't certain thinking beyond that was something I was entitled to do while there was still a war going on. And now I'd like to stay," he said, "if there's a place for me." The question was simple on the surface and complex underneath, and they both understood that perfectly. She stood up and refilled her coffee and came back to the table and sat down. "The farm needs work," she said. "I noticed. And I need help I can trust." "You can trust me," he said. "You know that." "I do know that," she said. "What I'm trying to say, in what might be an unnecessarily roundabout manner, is that there is absolutely a place for you here. The question of exactly what kind of place is one that I think we might need to discuss at more length than I'm prepared to have over breakfast." Something in his expression softened. "That seems reasonable," he said. "Good," she said. "Then eat your breakfast and let's look at that barn roof." The barn roof was in worse shape than it had looked from the ground. They stood on top of it together in the clear, cold morning, both of them, with the town of Caldwell Creek laid out below them, and the flat Kansas horizon stretching away in every direction, and assessed the damage with the shared eye of people who have both been raised to solve problems practically before discussing them emotionally. 2 or 3 days of work with the right materials," he said, walking carefully along the ridge. "I know I've been putting it off." "Why?" "Because I couldn't hold the lumber in place and nail it at the same time," she said, "and I was too proud to ask for help." He turned to look at her. There was the beginning of that almost smile again. "You could have asked." "I could have," she agreed. "I have a strong disinclination to do so. I remember that about you. Most people find it difficult." "I find it refreshing," he said. "I always did. You just take a longer route to the same destination that most people get to faster by admitting they need something." She looked at him with an expression that was partly annoyance and partly something warmer. "Are you going to help me with this roof, or are you going to analyze my personality?" "Both, probably," he said, and this time the smile arrived fully, and she turned away from it before her own face could do anything that she wasn't prepared to take full responsibility for yet. They worked on the barn roof for 3 days, and during those 3 days they fell back into the old rhythm of each other with a speed that was both entirely natural and quietly astonishing. He worked hard and well, without needing to be told where to begin or when to stop, and he had the particular quality that she had always valued in him of being able to be quietly alongside a person without filling the silence unnecessarily. They talked while they worked and did not talk while they worked in roughly equal measure, and both were comfortable. On the second day of roofing, Tom Briggs came by, which was notable because Tom Briggs had not left his own property much since his return. He stood at the base of the barn and looked up at the two figures on the roof and said, "Wallace Weston, you old something or other," in a tone that was genuinely glad, and Wallace came down the ladder and the two of them stood in the yard and did what men of that era, and in that place, did when they were glad to see each other, which was shake hands very firmly and exchange a few brief sentences and look at the ground and then look at the sky, and generally communicate a great deal while appearing to communicate very little. Edith from the roof watched this transaction with something she recognized as hope, because Tom Briggs had been retreating further and further into himself, and the fact that he had walked over to her property on a cold November morning suggested that something was stirring. "Come have lunch," she called down. Tom looked up, surprised, as if he had forgotten she was there. "I don't want to impose," he said. "You're not," she said. "Get yourself inside and sit by the fire. I'll be down in 20 minutes. He went inside, which told her something about the state he was in, because the Tom Briggs she had known before the war would have argued. Lunch became an extended affair, the kind that happens when people who have things they need to say find themselves in a warm room with enough food and someone who is willing to listen. Tom didn't say much about the war directly, but he talked around the edges of it, and Wallace gave him room to do that, responding with quiet acknowledgments that showed he understood without pushing for more. Edith kept the food coming and the coffee hot, and contributed to the conversation when she was useful, and stayed out of it when she was not. When Tom finally left in the mid-afternoon, she stood at the door and watched him walk up the road with a slightly different posture than he had arrived with, not fixed, not even close to fixed, but fractionally less bent, and she thought that this was how things actually healed, not in single moments but in accumulation. He needed that, Wallace said from behind her. He needed to be around people who wouldn't ask him to explain himself, she said. You're good at that. People have needed it a lot lately, she said. This town it's been a hard few years. And the men who have come back, some of them had easier times than others, and it doesn't matter which way it was, they all needed someone not to treat them like they were broken. He was quiet. She turned back from the doorway and found him looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Are you, she asked carefully, broken? He thought about that with the seriousness it deserved. There are parts of me that aren't the same as they were, he said. I don't think I'm broken exactly. I think I'm rearranged. Some things moved around inside and haven't quite settled back yet. That seems honest. I try to be. I know you do, she said. I appreciate it. The third day of roofing finished the job, and they stood back and looked at the barn with the particular satisfaction that comes from work completed properly, and he said, "What's next?" in the tone of someone who has every intention of remaining. "North fencing," she said. "And then there's a section of the creek bank that's eroding, and if we don't address it before spring, it's going to take out part of the east pasture." "Show me." They walked the property in the cold afternoon light, and she showed him every problem and every plan, and he listened and asked practical questions and offered practical suggestions. And by the time they came back in for the evening, there was an understanding between them that had not been formally spoken, but was as solid as the repaired barn roof. It was on the 5th night of his return, after the dishes were washed and the fire was burning steadily, and the candle was in the window. She had kept putting the candle in the window because it was habit now, because it felt right, though the reason for it was sitting right across from her, that the conversation changed its quality. They had been reading, she with the newspaper that came from Wichita twice a week and he with the almanac she kept on the shelf, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that they had established through days of working alongside each other. But then he set the almanac down and looked at her in a way that had a different quality to it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "Why me?" he said. "There were other men. Before the war, I know there were. And during, I imagine there were men in town who, I'm just asking. I've been wondering the whole ride back. What made you, why did you keep the light on for me specifically?" She lowered the newspaper. "You want the honest answer or the pretty one?" "The honest one always." "Because you see me," she said. "That's it. That's all of it, really. Some people look at a person and see what they expect to see or what they want to see or what they're afraid to see. You always just saw me exactly as I am, and you didn't seem to find that troubling." He was quiet for a moment. "It's not troubling at all," he said. You're the most clear-eyed person I've ever known. It's one of the things that he stopped. "I'm going about this the wrong way. How would the right way go?" He stood up from his chair with the deliberate movement of a man making a decision, which was how he made most decisions, thoughtfully and with a kind of settled purpose, and he crossed the small distance between their chairs and stood in front of her. She looked up at him with her characteristic directness. "I love you," he said. "That's what I've been building up to saying for a considerable number of years, and I would like to have said it before I rode away to war, but I was a foolish 26-year-old who thought he needed to wait for the right moment and the right words in the right circumstances. And I've learned since then that there is no such thing as a right moment. There are only moments, and you either say the thing in them or you don't." She set the newspaper on the table. "Wallace Weston," she said. "Edith Monroe." "I have loved you," she said carefully, "since you helped me get the mule out of the mud in the spring of 1860, which was not a romantic occasion in any conventional sense, but which was the moment I understood that you were someone who would show up and do the unglamorous necessary thing without being asked, and without expecting any credit for it. And I decided at that time that you were the kind of person I wanted in my life." The almost smile was there again, the one she had been watching come and go for days. "The mule incident," he said. "The mule incident," she confirmed. He reached down and took her hand, and she stood up, and they were very close together in the firelight with the winter dark outside, and the candle in the window and the warm smell of the kitchen around them. And he kissed her, finally, after years of waiting and months of separation and 43 days of riding home. It was everything she had imagined and also entirely different from anything she had imagined, which was how the best things tended to be. When they pulled back, she kept her hand in his and looked at him with a clear, steady happiness that was entirely her own and entirely unperformed. "I should tell you," she said, "that I intend to keep the farm." He nodded. "I know. And I intend to run it the way I see fit. I would expect nothing less. And I'm going to need you to understand that when I give you my opinion on something, I mean it and I'd like it to be taken seriously." "Edith," he said, with the warmth of someone who has been paying complete attention for years, "I have never once not taken your opinion seriously. I may occasionally think you're wrong, which I will say, and we will discuss it, but I have always taken you seriously." "That is an acceptable arrangement," she said. "Good," he said. "Now, is there any more of those biscuits?" She laughed genuinely, and the sound surprised her with its own fullness, the sound of relief as much as amusement, the sound of a person who has been holding something with both hands for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. There was, in fact, more biscuits. The next several weeks were full of the practical work of two people beginning to build something together that would have to last. Wallace rode into town one morning and spoke to Reverend Dalton and to old Clarence Duffy at the general store, who was something of an unofficial record-keeper for the community. He had no intention of creating any gossip about Edith or doing anything that would give the more opinionated residents of Caldwell Creek material for their conversations. He was staying at her farm, which some people were already noting, and while the arrangement was entirely proper given the size of the farmhouse and the separate sleeping quarters, he understood the community he was in, and he intended to manage it correctly. He came back from town with a look of settled purpose and found her mending harnesses in the barn. "I spoke to Reverend Dalton," he said. She looked up. "About what?" "About a wedding," he said. "If that's what you want, I'm asking. Properly this time. Not the halfway version I gave you on the porch before the war. I'm asking you, Edith, to marry me, because I love you and because I would very much like the rest of my life to involve you in it as completely as possible." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the barn, the wind was moving through the bare branches, and Corporal the mule was expressing his views about something in the paddock. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." "Obviously," he repeated, smiling fully now, no qualification or preliminary. "Was there ever any doubt?" "On my part, constantly," he said. "On your part, apparently never." "I don't waste time on doubt," she said. "I investigated the question thoroughly at the outset, reached a conclusion, and then committed to it. That is an extremely efficient approach to falling in love. I find it saves a great deal of unnecessary suffering." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture, but there was in it the ease of a person who has been given permission to do the tender things, and she leaned into it slightly in the way of a person who has been waiting for the tender things for a respectable amount of time and is not going to pretend otherwise. They were married on a Saturday in December of 1865, in the small white church with the cracked bell that rang anyway because someone rang it anyway because the sound, even cracked, was the right sound for the occasion. Reverend Dalton performed the ceremony with a warmth that was genuine, and Agnes Peel cried, which she would later strenuously deny, and Tom Briggs was there and looked better than he had looked since his return, and even Corporal the mule seemed to be in a marginally more cooperative mood than usual. Edith wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her, cream-colored wool with small pearl buttons at the cuffs, and she carried a bunch of winterberries tied with a ribbon, because that was what December in Kansas offered, and she was not a woman who resented reality for failing to provide roses. Wallace wore his best shirt and a coat he had borrowed from Tom Briggs, who was broader in the shoulders, so it fit him well, and he stood at the altar with the look of a man who has arrived, finally, at the exact right place. When Reverend Dalton asked the questions, and they gave the answers, and Wallace slid the plain gold band onto her finger, a band he had purchased from the jeweler in Wichita who came through with the trading wagon once a month, the cracked bell rang again outside, unprompted, as if the wind itself had swung the rope, and several people later said this was a sign of something good. And while Edith was not inclined toward signs, she was inclined toward this one, just this once. The wedding dinner was held at the farm, because the farm was now fully theirs together, and Agnes Peel and Harriet Bloom and several other women of the community had come ahead of the ceremony to lay out enough food to feed a considerably larger gathering: cold ham and roasted potatoes, and 3 kinds of pie, and the bread that Mrs. Gunderson brought because her bread was the best in Caldwell Creek, and everyone knew it, and she brought it to every important occasion as a matter of civic pride. They celebrated in the way that communities on the frontier celebrated, with warmth and laughter, and the particular quality of joy that comes when people who have endured hard times together are given a reason to remember that good things are still possible. There was music, a fiddle and a borrowed guitar, and there was dancing on the swept wooden floor of the farmhouse's main room, and there was the clean cold air coming in through the briefly open door whenever someone arrived or departed, and there was firelight and lamplight and the smell of good food. And at some point in the evening, Wallace and Edith were dancing together in the small clear space they had managed in the middle of the room, and he said quietly, close to her ear, "Are you happy?" And she said, with the full clear-eyed honesty that was her most essential quality, "Yes, completely." He held her a little closer, and they moved through the rest of the dance without needing to say anything more. That night, after the last of the guests had gone home, and the dishes had been stacked and the fire had been banked, she walked through the house checking the windows and doors in the way that she always did before bed, the habitual circuit of a woman who has been responsible for her own property for 3 years. When she got to the parlor window, she stopped and looked at it, and for a moment stood very still. The candle holder was there, the brass one from her mother. It was empty. She had not replaced the candle tonight, had not thought of it in the excitement of the day, and for a moment she felt something odd about its absence, the way you feel the absence of a sound you've lived with so long you stopped noticing it. Wallace was behind her. She heard his step, knew it by now. "What are you doing?" he said. "Looking at the window," she said. He came to stand beside her and looked at the empty candle holder. He was quiet for a moment, understanding. "You don't need it anymore," he said gently. "I know," she said. "I know that, you can still light it," he said. "If you want to, it doesn't have to mean waiting anymore. It can just be a light." She looked at him. There was something in what he had said that was so precisely right that she felt it like a note struck cleanly on a cold morning. She found the stub of a candle in the kitchen drawer and set it in the holder and lit it, and it threw its small, warm light into the cold winter window, and it meant something entirely different now and also the same thing, because keeping the light on was never really about waiting. It was about choosing to believe that the thing you hoped for was real enough to deserve the gesture. "There," she said. "There," he agreed. They stood together at the window looking out at the dark winter yard, and the candle burned in the glass, and Caldwell Creek was quiet and cold and full of the particular peace that comes after a long difficulty. And Edith Monroe, who was now Edith Weston, kept her husband's hand and did not feel even a small desire to be anywhere else in the world. The winter deepened, but the farm held. Wallace threw himself into the work of the property with a wholehearted commitment that impressed even the most skeptical of the neighbors who had had opinions about Edith managing alone and whether she might need to sell. He had a farmer's instincts, deep and practical, and he and Edith worked well together, which was not a surprise to either of them, but was gratifying to confirm in the actual daily circumstances of shared labor. The north fence was repaired in December, working in cold that put their breath into the air in long white plumes, passing nails and wire back and forth with efficient silence. The creek bank problem was addressed in January with a project involving cut timber and a significant amount of mud despite the cold, and 3 of the neighboring farmers came to help, because Wallace had gone to ask them in a way that made asking into a natural thing rather than an imposition, which was a skill that Edith recognized and appreciated, being someone who found asking difficult herself. In February, there was a dispute in town that required attention. It involved a man named Castor Ewell who had arrived in Caldwell Creek during the war years and had established a kind of informal claim over several properties whose owners had gone to fight and whose families had been struggling. He had been making the kind of moves that were not technically illegal in each individual instance, but were clearly intended to consolidate pressure on people who were already stretched, offering loans at rates that were not quite usury, but were heading in that direction, and acquiring small debts and calling them in at inconvenient times. Tom Briggs was one of the people under this kind of pressure. His property taxes had fallen behind, and Castor Ewell had purchased the note from the county office, and was now in a position to push for collection on terms that Tom was struggling to meet. Tom came to the farm on a Sunday, working himself up to saying it for most of the visit before finally getting the words out, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands. Edith and Wallace listened to the whole of it without interruption. "What does he actually need?" Wallace asked when Tom had finished. "He needs $60, Edith said before Tom could answer. "That's what the note is for. $60 by the end of March." Tom looked at her. "You knew." "Agnes Peel told me some of it," she said. "I figured the rest. Tom, we can help with the $60. Tom straightened in his chair. "I'm not taking charity." "It's not charity," Wallace said. "Edith and I talked about this last week. We're proposing a working arrangement. You help us with the spring planting in April and May, which is genuinely labor we need and are willing to pay for, and we advance you a portion of that pay now in time to clear the note. It's a business transaction, plain and simple." Tom looked from Wallace to Edith and back again, and she could see him working through the proposition and finding it legitimate and finding himself allowed to accept it. "You planned this," he said. "We prepared for several possibilities," Edith said. "This was one of them." Tom Briggs put his hat back on his head and rubbed his face with one hand and then nodded once, briefly. "All right," he said. The situation with Castor Ewell was also addressed in a more direct manner. Wallace, along with Jim Adler, who was Peter Adler's father and someone with a considerable amount of standing in the community, went to see Ewell at his establishment one afternoon and had a conversation with him that was never fully reported, but that resulted in Ewell becoming notably less aggressive about his various notes and acquisitions in the weeks that followed. Exactly what was said was a subject of some speculation in Caldwell Creek, but the outcome was clear enough. The pressure on the returning veterans and their families eased. "What did you say to him?" Edith asked when Wallace came home that evening. "We explained the community's perspective on his business practices," Wallace said. "Without violence, I hope." "Almost entirely," he said, and then saw her expression and added, "There was no violence. We were very clear and very direct, and Ewell understood that the community was paying attention, which was the essential information he needed to have." She studied him for a moment. "You could have let me come." "I could have," he agreed. "Would you have wanted to?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but I would have wanted the choice." "That's fair," he said. "I'll remember that." They were learning each other in the married version, finding the edges and accommodations that were different from the courtship version, which had been conducted largely in the context of roofwork and fence repair and candlelight. There were disagreements. Nothing serious, nothing that touched the foundation, but the genuine kind that come from two strong-willed people with their own established ways of doing things trying to share a household. In March, they had a real argument about money, about whether to sell 2 of the cattle now or wait until summer when the prices would likely be better, but when there was also the risk of them not being better. And Edith's position and Wallace's position were genuinely different, and neither of them had the disposition to yield simply for the sake of harmony. They argued about it directly and at length, and then both went quiet for an evening, and then in the morning Edith came to the table and said, "You were right about the risk," and Wallace said, "You were right about the timing being uncertain," and they decided to sell one now and wait on the other 2, which was neither of their original positions but was better than both. This was, Edith reflected, what it looked like when 2 competent people ran something together. Not agreement on everything. Not one deference to the other. The actual work of weighing 2 good minds against each other and finding the result in the middle or somewhere else entirely. Spring came in late March, early April, the way Kansas spring comes, not gently, but with a rush of wind and sudden green and the smell of the creek rising in the warmer days and the cattle restless in the pasture, and the whole world organizing itself for another round of growing. Edith planted her kitchen garden in the first week of April, down on her knees in the dark soil that she had tended for 3 years alone, and was now tending with her husband beside her. And she put seeds in with the same care. She always put them in and thought about what it meant to tend the same ground year after year, to know a piece of earth well enough to understand its moods and trust its capacity. Tom Briggs came to help with the planting as agreed, and he was better than he had been in the winter, noticeably so. He talked more, laughed occasionally, and one afternoon he mentioned, with a careful casualness that didn't fool either of them, that he had been speaking with the widow Clara Marsh, who had come to Caldwell Creek the previous autumn with her 2 young children after her husband died at Shiloh, and that she seemed like a fine woman, and that he had helped her clear a fallen tree from her fence line last week. Edith and Wallace exchanged a look over Tom's bent head as he worked, and the look contained an entire brief conversation that resulted in Edith suggesting that it would be very nice to have Clara Marsh and her children over for Sunday dinner sometime, and Tom saying perhaps that might be a good idea, and that being the end of it for the moment, but clearly not the actual end of it. Clara Marsh turned out to be a steady, clear-eyed woman of about 30 with 2 children, a boy of 7 named James and a girl of 5 named Ruth, who had the particular resilience that certain people develop when they have had to manage difficult circumstances with limited resources. She and Edith took to each other with the directness of women who had both been managing on their own and knew what that required and respected it in others. Tom Briggs at Sunday dinner was a study in careful hope, which was something that Edith found she had a great deal of feeling about, having been a careful hoper herself for several years. The summer of 1866 settled over the farm with the particular heat that Kansas summers brought, a dry, blazing heat that required every drop of water to be used thoughtfully, and made the evenings feel like gifts after the grinding work of the afternoons. Edith and Wallace had developed by now the settled rhythms of a well-functioning partnership, knowing each other's working pace and temperament, and capable of communicating across the garden or the pasture with a look or a gesture that would have required sentences a year before. On a hot evening in June, sitting on the porch after supper with the last of the light still painting the sky in shades of orange and amber, Wallace reached over and took her hand. They had been sitting comfortably in silence for several minutes, which was one of the things she valued most about him, his comfort with silence, and she turned to look at him. "I have something to tell you," he said. She waited. "I've been happy," he said, as if this required announcing. "I want you to know that I've been genuinely happy here this spring, this summer. I wasn't certain I was going to be able to say that again." She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said. "I can see it. I wasn't sure you could. I wasn't sure I was showing it properly." "You show it the way you do everything," she said. "Without excess or performance. It's there if you know how to look. And you know how to look." "I've been looking at you for years," she said. "I know every version of your face." The summer deepened. The grain came up strong in the east field, which had been the concern going into the season, and the vegetable garden produced abundantly enough that Edith was putting up preserved vegetables in glass jars for 3 weeks in a row in late July and early August, the kitchen steaming with the work of it, and Wallace helped with the heavy lifting and the carrying and occasionally with the peeling, which he did competently enough, though he complained that it was worse than any military assignment he'd been given. "Worse than sleeping in a Georgia swamp?" she asked. "Different," he said. "The swamp was unpleasant in a straightforward way. This peeling is relentless." She handed him another potato. He peeled it without further protest. In August, Edith realized she was pregnant. She recognized the signs for what they were and sat with the knowledge for a few days before telling Wallace, not from any desire to keep it from him, but simply because she had the habit of confirming things to her own satisfaction before reporting them, a trait that was entirely consistent with her character. She told him on a Sunday morning after breakfast, when the day was still quiet. She said it plainly because she was always plain and watched his face. His face did the thing she had not seen it do before. The careful, guarded quality that he carried in his expression, the layer of management that had been there since he returned from the war, that she had understood, was his way of keeping some of the residue of those years at a distance from the daily surface. That quality fell away entirely, and what was underneath was so purely glad that she felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. He came around the table and held her, standing in the kitchen with the Sunday morning quiet around them, and said into her hair, "Thank you," which was perhaps not the most conventional response, but was, she thought, exactly right, because it contained within it not thanks for a thing done to benefit him, but thanks for the fact of the future itself, for its continued presence and possibility. "It will be a great deal of work," she said, against his shoulder. "Everything good is," he said. The news moved through Caldwell Creek in the way that news moves through small communities, quickly and with its own momentum, and produced the warm response that such news generally produces: genuine congratulations and offers of assistance, and a general collective satisfaction at the evidence of new life establishing itself in a place that had been dealing with its losses. Agnes Peel came by with a knitted blanket that she had apparently been working on for some time, which suggested she had anticipated this development before being officially informed of it. And Edith did not mention this because it was a very good blanket. The autumn of 1866 had the quality of abundance that follows a good growing season, combined with the particular softness that Edith privately associated with pregnancy. The way the world became slightly more vivid in certain moments, the colors of the turning leaves more saturated, the smell of the cooling air more complex, the sound of Wallace's step on the porch boards in the evening more precisely itself. She kept working at her usual pace, which caused some comment from the more conventional members of the community, but which she addressed by continuing to work at her usual pace. She felt well and she had things to do, and she was not going to retire to the parlor sofa because she was expecting, a custom she found both impractical and mildly insulting to the body's actual capabilities. Wallace watched her with an attention that was fond and slightly anxious in equal measure, and she let him know when she genuinely needed his help and let him know when she did not. And the balance of this was managed between them with the same directness that characterized everything between them. Tom Briggs and Clara Marsh had, by October, arrived at an arrangement that seemed likely to become permanent, which Edith observed with quiet satisfaction. Tom had repaired Clara's fence entirely, and then built her a new chicken coop that was considerably better than the old one, and Clara had been feeding him supper twice a week, and the two of them had been seen walking along the creek path on Sunday afternoons with James and Ruth running ahead of them. And if that was not a courtship by any reasonable standard, then nothing was. November arrived, and with it the anniversary of Wallace's return, which they noted privately, just the two of them at the kitchen table after dinner, with a simplicity that was more meaningful than any ceremony. A year since the horse came up the road. A year since she had walked out of the barn and found him there. A year of everything that had followed. "I should thank you properly," he said. "For what?" "For the candle," he said. "For keeping it there every night. I know you're not a sentimental woman, and I know you'll tell me it was practical and not romantic, but I want you to know that it meant everything. When I crossed into Kansas and I knew I was getting close, I kept thinking about it, whether it was still there, whether you'd—" He stopped. "I needed it to be there." "It was there," she said. I know it was. "And it's still there," she said, nodding toward the window where the candle burned as it did every evening. "I told you." "It doesn't mean the same thing anymore. It just means we're here. There's someone here and there's a light, and whoever needs it can find it." He looked at the candle, and then at her, and in the firelight and the candlelight together his face had the quality of a man who has come very far and arrived at a very good place and knows both things with full appreciation. "I love you," he said, the way he had been saying it since that evening months ago, simply and without qualification. "And I love you," she said the same way. The baby arrived in February of 1867, in the deep cold of a Kansas winter night, with Agnes Peel and Clara Marsh in attendance and Wallace in the kitchen, because Agnes Peel had firm views about where husbands should be during such proceedings, and Wallace had learned that some things were not worth arguing about. He heard the cry from the kitchen, the first one, thin and indignant in the way of all new arrivals, and he gripped the edge of the table and waited. Agnes Peel came to the kitchen doorway after several minutes that were the longest minutes of his experience, including some genuinely difficult moments in the war, and she said, with the smile that her face reserved for only the best occasions, "A boy, strong and healthy." He was allowed in then, and he came to the bed where Edith lay, tired and radiant in the particular way of that specific exhaustion, with the baby wrapped in the good knitted blanket from Agnes, and she looked up at him with eyes that were bright and clear and held in them the same quality he had loved about her from the beginning, the direct and honest light of a person who is entirely present. "Come and see," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she turned the blanket back a little and he looked at his son, red-faced and squinting and regarding the world with the preliminary suspicion that all newborns seem to bring to the enterprise. He was perfect. He was absolutely entirely perfect. "What do we call him?" Wallace said, his voice carefully steady. "I've been thinking about James," she said, "after my father." "James Weston," he said, and the name settled comfortably as good names do. "Yes, that's right." He put his hand very carefully against the baby's head, the soft, impossible warmth of it, and felt something in him go quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of sleep or rest or any of the ordinary silences. This was the quiet of something completed, something arrived at after a very long journey by a route that had involved considerable uncertainty and the requirement of sustained faith. "He's beautiful," he said. "He looks like a very small, very angry man," Edith said, with the precise, affectionate dryness of a woman who loves the thing she is describing. "He is a very small man," Wallace said. "He'll grow into himself." "They all do," she said, and closed her eyes for a moment. "Go let everyone know he's here." He went and told Agnes and Clara, and then he went to the kitchen and stood at the window. The winter dark was complete outside, the Kansas sky brilliant with cold stars, and the candle in the window burned its small, reliable flame, and Wallace Weston, who had ridden 43 days home to tell a woman what she already knew, stood in the warm kitchen of the farm they shared, and understood that there were things in this life that surpassed every expectation a person could reasonably form of it. The spring that followed the birth of James was busy in the way that springs on a working farm are busy, and also in the way that springs are busy when there is a new person in the house who requires significant attention and has opinions about sleep schedules that don't align with anyone else's. Edith managed with her characteristic efficiency and without complaint, and Wallace took on everything he could, and they moved through the sleep-deprived weeks of early parenthood with the same directness and practicality that characterized everything they did together. James was a solid, good-tempered baby, which made things easier. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's clear, evaluating gaze, and by April he was looking around at the world with an interest that both parents found enormously gratifying. Tom Briggs and Clara Marsh were married in March, a quiet ceremony at the church, and James attended his first wedding bundled in his knitted blanket, sleeping through most of the service in Edith's arms. Tom at the altar looked like a man who had come back from a very dark place and found light in an unexpected direction, and Clara, standing beside him with her children on her other side, looked like a woman who had every intention of building something solid and permanent on the foundation of what she had endured. It was a good wedding. The summer was productive. James grew. The farm expanded modestly. 20 more acres acquired in a sensible transaction with an older farmer named Calloway who was moving to live with his daughter in Missouri and wanted his land to go to people who would work it properly. Wallace worked those acres with a focused energy that Edith recognized as something deeper than ambition, the satisfaction of a man building toward something real and lasting. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and James was fed and settled, they sat on the porch in the summer warmth, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and the farm spread out in front of them in the golden late light, and the town of Caldwell Creek was visible in the middle distance, and the whole western sky went through its evening performance of color, and Edith would think about what it meant to be exactly where you were supposed to be. The candle burned in the window every night. She had simply kept the habit, transferred its meaning, and it had become what Wallace said it could become, just a light that said someone was home and the door was open and the world outside was less dark for it. Agnes Peel took great personal credit for the way things had turned out, which was not accurate but was harmless, and Edith let her have it because Agnes had genuinely been a good neighbor through the difficult years, and the credit was small payment for that. By the autumn of 1867, Edith and Wallace had established themselves as one of the more reliably productive farms in the county, known for clean cattle and well-kept land, and a willingness to help neighbors when help was genuinely needed. They had a reputation that both of them had built by simply doing what they had always done, working hard and being honest, and not pretending that either of those things were more than they were. There was a fall evening in October when they were walking the fence line of the new acres, checking the condition of the posts before winter, and James was on Wallace's back in a cloth carrier that Edith had constructed from a method she'd read about, looking out at the world with enormous interest from his elevated position, and the light on the fields was the particular amber gold of Kansas autumn. And Edith stopped at the far corner of the property and stood looking back toward the farmhouse with the smoke coming from its chimney and the last of the sun on its walls. "What are you thinking?" Wallace asked, coming to stand beside her. "That my father would have liked you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What makes you think so?" "He liked people who worked," she said, "and people who meant what they said. He would have taken you out to look at the north fence on the first day you came by and asked your opinion of the posts, and if you gave him an honest answer instead of a flattering one, that would have been it. He would have decided you were all right. What would you have told him, if you could?" She looked at the farmhouse, at the candlelight beginning to show faintly in the window as the afternoon darkened, the candle that she would have set before she came out, as she always did. "I would have told him to be patient," she said. "That the right things take the time they take." James made a sound of general satisfaction from his position on his father's back, and Wallace turned his head and said something quiet to the baby, some small private communication that made James wave his hand at the sky, and Edith watched the two of them together in the failing light and felt the full weight of her happiness, which was not light at all but heavy and solid and entirely good, the weight of something real. They walked back to the farmhouse in the cooling air, the three of them, and the candle in the window gave its small faithful light to guide them home, and when they reached the door and Wallace pushed it open with his shoulder and they came into the warmth, she thought about the night 2 years before when a lean, road-worn man had ridden up to this same house to tell her the war was over, when she already knew, when she had already kept the light on for him through 2 years and 7 months of waiting. And she thought about how that moment contained everything that came after, James and the new acres and the repaired barn, and the winter mornings with coffee and the summer evenings on the porch, all of it present in that single moment, the way a seed contains the full outline of what it will become. The winter of 1867 into 1868 was cold and long and fully managed, because they were managing it together. And the farmhouse was warm, and the stores were adequate, and James learned to pull himself upright against the furniture, and regard the world from a new height with enormous satisfaction. Wallace spent the winter evenings reading aloud when Edith was mending, and she spent the winter mornings teaching him the accounting system she had developed for the farm, which he accepted with suitable admiration of its organization, and they argued twice more about money decisions, and resolved them in the same way as before, by taking both positions seriously and arriving at something better than either one alone. By the spring of 1868 James was walking, unsteady and thrilled with it, and the farm was planning its most ambitious planting season yet, and Tom Briggs had become a genuine presence in their lives, a friend to both of them in the specific way that people become friends when they have helped each other through difficult things and know the real version of each other. Clara Briggs now, had taken to the frontier with a competence that pleased Edith, and that her children, James and Ruth, had absorbed and made their own. Ruth Briggs, in particular, had the look of someone who would not be easily managed by the world's expectations of her, which Edith regarded as a very fine quality in a young girl. One evening in April, with the spring properly established and the planting begun, and James asleep in his room and the farmhouse quiet, Edith sat at the kitchen table with the letter she had received that morning from a cousin in Illinois who had been inquiring about the West, whether it was as difficult as people said, whether there was opportunity for a hard-working family. She was composing her reply, which would be honest about both the difficulty and the opportunity, because She did not believe in misleading people about what things actually required. Wallace came in from checking on the cattle and washed his hands at the basin and came to the table and sat down across from her. He had a letter of his own, which he had been putting off showing her for the 2 days since it arrived, and she had known he had something he was working up to but had not pushed, because she trusted him to arrive at it in his own time. "I have something to show you," he said. She set her pen down. He put the letter on the table between them. It was from a lawyer in Abilene, writing on behalf of a land company. They had an interest in acquiring some of the Weston acreage for a cattle drive corridor, and were prepared to offer a significant sum for a right-of-way agreement, not the land itself, just the right to use a specific strip along the south edge twice a year during the driving season. "Read it," he said. She read it. She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. "What do you think?" "I think it's a good offer," he said. "I think the terms are acceptable. I also think the cattle drives are going to change this whole region in the next 10 years, and being on good terms with the people who run them is not a bad position for a farming family. We'd need to negotiate the timing of the crossings," she said. "The spring crossing would have to be after we've established the young crops. If they drive through before the seedlings are set, we'd lose the east field." "I noticed that," he said. "I thought we could ask for a May window, no earlier than the 15th. She looked at the letter again. "The sum they're offering would pay for the new water trough system and still leave something toward a second milk cow. That's what I calculated." She looked at him across the table, and he looked at her, and they were two people who had been thinking about the same problem from two directions, and had arrived at the same understanding, which was always a particular satisfaction. "Write back and accept in principle with the May 15th condition," she said, "and mention that we'd expect the rate to be revisited after 2 years, because if the drives continue to expand, this right-of-way will be worth more to them." He smiled. "That last part is good." "I know," she said. She went back to her letter to the cousin in Illinois and wrote, as she had always written and always lived, the honest version, which was, "Yes, it is hard, and yes, there is opportunity, and yes, the combination of those two things is what makes it worth doing. And yes, the people who do well here are the people who go in with their eyes open, and their hands ready and their hearts set on something more than comfort." She sealed the letter and set it aside for posting and looked up to find Wallace watching her with the expression she knew the best out of all his expressions, the one that was just him, looking at her, with everything he felt visible in it for whoever knew how to look. "What?" She said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." "You do that too much," she said. "I did it too little for a long time," he said. "I'm making up for it." The summer of 1868 brought the cattle drives through, and the right-of-way arrangement proved to be everything they had hoped, and the money from it went where they had planned. And James, 18 months old, watched the cattle drive from the fence with wide eyes, and the expression of someone encountering the world's supply of cows in a single compressed viewing experience. The drive's trail boss, a weathered and experienced man named Cobb who had been moving Texas Longhorns up through Kansas for 2 seasons now, stopped by the farmhouse the evening of the passage to settle the agreement's paperwork, and he and Wallace sat on the porch and talked cattle and trail, and the business of driving for an hour while Edith brought out coffee and James sat on the porch step and tried to communicate with a beetle he had found. Cobb, who had seen a great deal of the West, looked at the farm with the eye of someone who appreciated good land well kept. "You've built something solid here," he said to them both. "We're working on it," Wallace said. Cobb looked at Edith with the respectful look of a man who recognizes competence. "This was her place first," he said, not as a question. "It was," she said. "Thought so," he said, nodding in the way of someone whose assessment has been confirmed. "The organization of it, the planning ahead. Men who build places from scratch tend to build them from the center out. Women who build places tend to build them from the future back. This looks like it was built from the future back." Edith considered this for a moment and decided she liked it. "That's accurate," she said. He tipped his hat and rode on. Wallace looked at her after he'd gone. "From the future back," he said. "It's how I think," she said. "I know," he said. "It's one of the reasons I kept coming home." The autumn of 1868 settled over Caldwell Creek with the amber warmth of a good season fully realized, and the farm went into its winter preparation with everything in order. The cattle were fat and the stores were full, and the water trough system was installed and functioning, and the second milk cow, whose name was Margaret because James had pointed at her and said something that was close enough to that, gave good milk. James Weston, almost 2 years old, moved through his world with a determined energy that was recognizable from both his parents, and that made the daily task of preventing him from investigating every dangerous thing in his environment a full-time occupation. He had words, a growing number of them, and he used them with authority, and his laugh was a large sound for a small person, and he had his mother's clear evaluating gaze and his father's dark hair, and the particular quality of presence that both of them had, and that apparently compounded rather than averaged when combined. On the last evening of November, the anniversary month of Wallace's return, they sat again at the kitchen table after dinner, as they had sat the year before on the anniversary itself, and Edith said what she had been thinking all day. "I want more of this," she said. He looked up. "More of what?" "This," she said, gesturing at the table, the room, the house, the general specific fact of their life together. "Another child, I mean, when it's time, and more years of this, all of it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture as that first evening when they had sat in this kitchen, and he had said the thing he had been working up to for years, and she had felt it with the delayed impact of a bell still ringing after the strike. "All of it," he agreed, "as much as we're given." The candle in the window burned on, into the November dark, over the frost-hard ground and the bare trees and the sleeping farm, out toward the long flat horizon, where the sky went on without interruption, a small fixed point of warmth and intention, sending its light into the dark the way such lights always have, without expectation of acknowledgement, simply because someone decided that the dark deserved an answer. 3 years after the war ended, and 2 years after Wallace Weston rode up that frost-hard road to tell Edith Monroe something she already knew, the farm was one of the most productive in the county. Their cattle were well regarded at market. Their name was associated with fair dealing and hard work, and their kitchen table had been the site of more good conversations than either of them could count. James turned 2 in February and celebrated the occasion by discovering that he could climb the porch railing, which required immediate architectural adjustment. He was a joyful, observant child who had already decided that his father was the best person to follow around the property, and that his mother was the authority on everything important, which reflected excellent judgment on his part. In the spring of 1869, the second child made its presence known. Edith told Wallace in the same kitchen, at the same table, in the same plain way, and watched his face do the same thing it had done the first time, that pure gladness without management or guard. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "James will have opinions about this." "James has opinions about everything," she said. "He'll adjust." The second child arrived in November of 1869, a girl this time, delivered again with Agnes Peel's capable assistance and Clara Briggs's calm company. She was smaller than James had been, but equally decided in her first expression of the world, which was a clear and focused gaze that suggested she was already taking inventory. Wallace came in and sat beside Edith and looked at his daughter and said, "She looks like you." "She looks like a baby," Edith said. "She looks like you looked the first time I ever saw you," he said, ready to assess everything and reserve judgment until she has sufficient information. Edith looked at the baby. That might actually be accurate," she said. They named her Frances, after no one in particular, because the name suited her, and she clearly already had a character that would suit a great many things. James, at 2.5, considered his sister with the careful evaluation of someone who is not sure yet whether this development is an asset or a liability, and then patted her head very gently with one finger, which was taken as endorsement. The farmhouse, over the years that followed, expanded to accommodate them. A room added, then another, the porch extended, the garden grown larger, the herd grown from 12 to 30 head of well-kept cattle, the land from 40 acres to 62, and through all of it the candle burned in the parlor window every evening, because Edith had never stopped lighting it and never would. There was an evening in the autumn of some years later when James, who was growing fast and starting to look like a tall version of his father, asked about the candle. He had grown up with it. It was simply part of how evenings happened, but he was at an age for questions. "Why do you always put the candle there?" he asked. "Every single night." Edith looked at Wallace and Wallace looked at her. "Come sit down," she said to James, and Francis, who went everywhere James went, came and sat beside him on the settle. And Edith told them about the war, not the details that weren't for children but the shape of it, and about the letters and the waiting and the 2 years and 7 months of lighting the candle every evening for a man who was far away, so that there would always be a direction that had a light on. "He came back," she said. "And when he got to Kansas and he was close to home, he said he thought about that light, whether it was still there." James looked at his father. "Was it there?" "It was there," Wallace said. "It was always there." James thought about this with the serious face that he wore when information was being processed. "And then you got married." "And then we got married," Edith said. "And then you had me," he said. "And then we had you," she agreed. "And then Francis." "Francis somewhat later," Wallace said. Francis, who had a quality of composed attention that had been noted by everyone who knew her since infancy, looked at the window where the candle was burning. "Is it still there for someone?" she asked. "Is it still waiting for someone?" Edith looked at the candle for a moment. "Not waiting," she said. "It's just there, so that anyone who needs to find their way home can see it." Francis considered this and found it satisfactory. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Edith and Wallace sat in the parlor as they had sat 1,000 evenings, comfortable in the settled warmth of a life that had been built with intention and care. And the candle burned in its place, and the Kansas night was full outside, stars in the immense dark above the flat land, and the farm slept around them, the cattle and the horses and the sleeping garden and the good Kansas soil resting toward another spring. "Are you happy?" she asked, turning the question back on him, the one he had asked her once in the early warmth of a first summer. He looked at her with the face she knew every version of by now, every morning version and every tired evening version and every pleased version and every worried version, and the one he wore right now, which was the one that was simply and completely himself, no management or guard, the face of a man who has found the right place and knows it. "Yes," he said. "Completely." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and the candle gave its faithful light to the dark outside, and to the room inside, and to the 2 people sitting in it who had come a long way from a porch goodbye and a candle first lit in an empty window, and all the way to this, to the full and quiet and specific happiness of a life that had been built well and would continue, with all its difficulty and work and occasional argument and perpetual care, for as long as they were given to build it. The light was on. It had always been on. And now it burned not for waiting but for welcoming, not for hope deferred but for hope fulfilled and daily renewed, for the fact of this house and these children and this man and this woman who had found each other across a war and who held on still, and would hold on in all the mornings and evenings and seasons to come, for as long as the candle burned and the farm stood, and the great flat Kansas sky went on and on above it all, indifferent and magnificent and full of stars.